Hello everyone, welcome back to another Emacs video. I'm Jake, and today I thought we'd take a look at my Emacs configuration. Now, this is a video I've been wanting to do for a while now, and I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, and this is a topic that's pretty simple, I know well. So I thought I'd walk you through my entire Emacs configuration. Now, this Emacs configuration has been growing for upwards of a year, and I know that many people's Emacs configurations are larger or smaller or more interesting or less interesting. Whenever I look at someone else's Emacs configuration, I always find that I learned something new. So what I thought I'd do is go through every one of my org mode headings, and as you can see, this is a literate config. Literate configuration means everything is written in this org mode file and outputted to an init.el file. And I'll go through each of the headings, and you can skip ahead or skip behind if you'd want. Look in the description to find different timestamps. And I thought that maybe you could learn a little something from my Emacs configuration. So without further ado, let's begin by looking in the meta section. Now the meta section is pretty straightforward, and this is more of a note to myself. Now I have a list of dependencies, programs which I've installed for Emacs because I have found them useful, or they might be required. So if in the future I need to upload this to a new computer, that can be done. Next is the startup. Now startup contains the beginning of my early init file, where I do a little bit of garbage collection options, as well as some of the byte compiling and native compilation options. Now I also set my packages in here. I add Melpa to the list, and for some reason I need this line to make sure it works on my Mac. And I also set my package list. Now this isn't strictly necessary since I use package, but it helps me keep track of what packages I'm using. And then I use the standard use package options here. I also use GCMH, which is a garbage collection package, and this is supposed to help make your Emacs a little bit faster. Now to the files and variables, etc. Now I load a few custom list files, mainly my custom functions file, which you can find publicly, my private.el, where I contain some private bits of code that isn't shared on GitHub, my custom file, and I also add the slash Lisp folder to my load path. Now I also set some registers in here because I like to move around using registers. And I also set my path. Now this is silly and probably a little more complicated than it needs to be. Most people use exec path from shell, but this way, I don't know, I don't need another package, and it seems to work just fine. So I use virtual env. I'm on a Mac, so I'm using pyenv. I'm using the text in a certain folder, and just putting all these here makes sure that all gets loaded properly. Next is general configuration. Now this is one I'm not going to go through every line specifically, but these are just a bunch of little lines that I've found that seem to make my Emacs experience a little bit better. So we set the initial buffer modes. These are our little window functions. You can read the comment on each of these. My defaults for how I like lines to work. Ending sentences with a one space instead of a double space. Now this helps when you want to navigate different sentences, for example, in org mode. Scrolling options, a few little Mac options, setting my trash directory. Now this means that when I delete files, I don't move them immediately, they're not immediately deleted, they're moved to the trash. A few prompt options, also managing my lock files, backups, that sort of stuff, recent files, these sorts of things. Now this one's pretty useful. Setting the browse URLs. These are the paths for the browse URL function. So you can use the browse-URL. And it has all these different browsers built in. So I use Firefox and Chrome so I can separate my two different email accounts. That's sort of complicated. But Firefox for personal, Chrome for work. And then this way I can specifically run a command to open a given URL in one of the two programs. Also, blinking the URL, these different little font optimizations and whatnot. I'm not going to, again, go through each of these individually, but feel free to try some out, describe the variables, try and understand what each of these does if you're interested. Next is the keyboard section. Now, first of all, since I'm on a Mac, I have to set up a few different of my modifiers. Now, by default, if you're on a Mac, the Option key is considered meta. I prefer the Command key to be meta. So when I want to do a meta X, I'll use Command X. I keep Control the same. I use Option as just a nothing. So if I were to, for example, use the Option key, I'll actually just end up typing the different modifiers that you can type in Mac OS, which I end up using sometimes. Everything else stays the same, except the right command becomes super, and the write control becomes hyper, and especially write command becoming super gives you a whole nother list of options that you can have. I also set this so that when I'm in the mini buffer, for example, I only need to hit escape once to do keyboard quit. Next is which key. This is just a simple, useful package you've probably seen before that'll show you all of your keybind options. So for example, if I do Control X, a mini buffer will pop up in the bottom that shows me all of the possible key chords after that. I also use evil mode, and these are my evil configurations. It's pretty basic using use package. I set a few initial states. For example, I prefer dashboard mode or the PDF view mode to be in motion mode. I also have a few basic key bindings like slash becomes swiper, things like that. I have a few key bindings here, but most of them are in another section. I set these cursor colors. I don't know why, I just have some preferences for what color each mode should be. So you can see if I'm in Emacs mode, it's blue. Normal mode, it's sort of a yellowish, and all these sorts of things. Now I also have a mode map for custom mode and calendar mode buffers where I want to press Q to actually kill the buffer. I do that here. Now, where I set most of my key bindings, and this is really the main, this is how I set all my key bindings in Emacs, is using a package called General.el. And I have it subdivided into a bunch of different sections, but like Doom Emacs and like Space Emacs, that's how I first came to Emacs, was through Space Emacs. I wanted to continue using the space leader key idea. Now, what that means is I'm in evil mode, so again, I'm in a normal mode, a command mode, so not every key is going to actually insert a character. When I press space, I have access to all these other options, and they're mnemonics. So for example, to do anything that has to do with a buffer, I do space B for buffer, and now I have all these options: switch buffers, delete buffer, etc., etc. So I will unroll the space leader key, and you can see each section here is divided into its own org mode heading. So there's the preamble, which defines the key map, what states it works in, and the prefix. And then I have these top level functions. So for example, let's just look here, and if I have space slash, it'll open ripgrep. So let's do space slash, and I get a ripgrep prompt right here. Or space happens to run metax. Now after that, I have the A, which would be applications for different things: org agenda, calc, move4e, opening browsers, that sort of stuff. I won't go in depth into each of these. Switching buffers, so for example, command or space BB would allow me to switch buffers. Files, different file management here. Here I have one of my custom functions, open buffer file mac. This is a bit of a long name, but if I do space F and then a capital O, I'll open the buffer in the Mac OS using the Mac OS open command. I also have some just personal commands here where I have my own commands to open my files, some files that I use a lot, to restart Emacs, to switch themes, that sort of thing. The help functions are in here, so describing variables, functions. I have a quick bind to go edit my dot file or to edit my init.org, which is this file. And I have different commands to switch modes. I also have some text management. Here's another command: copy the whole buffer to the system clipboard. So I do space X capital C, I'll copy the whole buffer to the clipboard, which is a pretty useful command. And I also have a few toggles, so space T can allow me to load another theme, or TM to hide the Modeline. Just different toggles that I find myself using often. And finally, I have a window management one. I actually don't use these as much now that I've created a little Hydra for managing windows, which I'll show in a little bit, but just in case you need those. Now I also have comma as a leader key. Now comma is for a mode's specific bindings. So let's say in eLisp mode or in Emacs Lisp mode, there are a few functions I find myself running all the time. For example, check parens, which is a nice command that'll allow you to, well, check if parens are balanced. So we could run it like this, and if we don't get any feedback, then they're fine. But if I add a parentheses here, and I run check parens, it's going to tell me that there's an unmatched bracket or quote. And I find myself running this often, so all I have to do is run comma C, and it'll run that effectively. I have the same with org mode, and this is another idea I took from Space Emacs. The comma bindings, I just have a lot of different options here in org mode. So opening the agenda, setting deadlines, setting properties. So I guess semantically, the space is for global functions, and then within a mode, the comma gives you access to functions that are only available in that mode. And I also have a few key maps that aren't under the comma bindings. So for example, using the meta and the square brackets, shifts, I like that to shift around headings. I have this quick keybind to export to HTML, and so on and so on. Now I also have key maps for all modes, and there's not much to say here. I don't want to talk too in depth about the specifics, and that's because I think everyone feels comfortable using different commands depending on their hand, the size of their hands, their keyboard layout. The key binds in Emacs are a very personal thing, so I try not to just talk about the actual keys, but how they're implemented and what I find useful. And I use council meta X instead of meta X since I'm an Ivy user here. Now I also use Hydra, and this is something I've been working on using more lately. Hydra is, I believe, it's considered a transient key map creator, which basically normally in Emacs, let's say you want to run a command multiple times, you would hit that key multiple times. So to switch, I'm trying to think of a base example. To undo, you do Control-X, U. But you have to run that multiple times. In a Hydra, it allows you to run a function as many times as you want without doing anything else. So a really basic one is using it to switch themes. Now, for some reason, I love to switch my themes around. So what I've done is created a Hydra with all of my favorite themes. And if I run the Hydra theme switcher, or my command space JHT, I get a prompt at the bottom, and I can press these keys to switch the theme. So 1 loads Doom Light, W, Q, all of these different keys can load different themes for me, and they'll allow me to switch back and forth. And apologies if this is bothering someone's screens. And now this is a Hydra I just created, and it was inspired by this link right here if you want to take a look. It's basically a window management Hydra, and you can see there's even a chart here to move, to split, to switch, and to resize. So for example, let's say I'd like to split and resize this window here. So I'll do Super O to open the Hydra, and I can press slash to split. And now I can use my arrow keys to sort of resize this buffer really easily. And you can see how this could become useful if you have, say, different multiple buffers here. You can navigate, resize. I can select a window, and I can press F to find a file if I'd like to open my custom.el file. Now I've really reconfigured my window layout if you're working on a big project or something. And I can run it again to actually delete those windows as well. And of course, again, this will be all in my GitHub. So if you want to just steal this from me completely, you can do that. Next is the interaction, editing, and files section. So we'll start off with my completion frameworks, which are Ivy, Council, Prescient, and Company. Now, Company provides auto suggestion and completion in buffers. So let's say I'm in an eLisp buffer and I want to set a variable. So it'll auto complete. So let's say I want to set queue, company, and I have all these options here, and company is the one that's providing those completions. Now, I'm not going to walk through every one of these configurations, but I will say that there are a lot of them. A lot of them have been lifted from different people's configurations, just things I've found I like. So, for example, minimum lengths, the tooltip limit, the front end, so where it's actually going to be used, where it's not going to be used, and that sort of thing. I can also set the font right here. Ivy. In Ivy, I have not actually too many configurations, but this is a nice little one if anyone's interested. I happen to look at the faces a lot if you're going to use describe face, and putting that little line in, adding Ivy format functions there will allow you to show a preview of the face in Council describe face, which is pretty neat. Now, I also use all the icons Ivy Rich and Ivy Rich, and what this does is it puts icons and a description inside of Ivy. So let's say I want to run a command. I'll do meta X, and you can see I have an icon on the left, and I also have a description. I have the definition on the right, and the same is true with describe variable, and you can see the icon depends on whether it's been customized or not, and the same with describe function, and so on and so on. And these are really useful. Not necessarily useful, but these are functions these are packages that make Emacs look pretty nice. I also use Council. And there's nothing much to say here. It comes with Ivy. And then Prescient. Now, Prescient, I haven't customized it in a while, but essentially what it does is it's when you use Ivy Prescient and Company Prescient, it will take those Ivy functions and it'll sort them by when they were last used. So if I'm going to run a command, you'll notice that my most recent command, the one at the top right here, is actually check parens. So essentially it saves my history and keeps it in order. So if I want to rerun a command, or I can see all my recent commands, I can see the last, well, what is it, the last 1,000 commands I've run, in case I want to look back and see what I'm running frequently. Now that's it for completion. I also use smart parens, and I'm not going to discuss because apparently I have some sort of comment here that I'm confused by smart parens, which is true. Smart parens essentially manages your parentheses. So if you put in, it'll autocomplete. There are times when when it knows that it shouldn't complete, and it's pretty smart. I'm not going to discuss this here because I've taken most of it from Emacs. I use fly spell or iSpell for my spell checking. Now there's this list here called iSpell skip region A list, and I've added these strings to the A list because in Emacs, in org mode, when I'm writing a source block or a properties block, there's no reason for it to spell check inside there because, well, there's no reason to spell check code because that's usually not going to be a word in the dictionary, so we ignore that. And I also set the modes where I want iSpell to be used, so in org mode and in move or compose mode. And I also have some key maps here, so for right-clicking and middle-clicking when I'm using my mouse, which is pretty rare because I'm using evil, but just in case. There's also a command called evil anzu, which is search and replace, which you can look up. For clipboard management, I use Simple Clip. I tend to use my system keyboard a lot as well, copying and pasting. And to be honest, Emacs clipboard never quite did it for me. And I've always had problems. So I use Simple Clip and it worked perfectly now. I even use Command C to copy. I know it's not normal to Emacs, but it works perfectly for me. And I also use Command V to paste. And I have this little function in case I need to copy the whole thing. Now going with that, for a little simplicity, I know people like undo tree, people like the way Emacs undoing works. Honestly, I don't. I use undo foo, and this is just the most basic undo and redo you could imagine. It works just as if you were writing in Microsoft Word on Windows XP or whatever. It's just exactly as you'd expect, and it works fine for me, so I don't worry about that. I use super save mode. This will save automatically. It'll automatically save my files when I'm idle, and also when I haven't, when I switch focus. So for example, if this is my scratch buffer here, and this is my init file, you can see on the bottom, if you look at the bottom right there, you can see the file's unsaved. If I switch to the other window, it's actually written that file. So this way I'm never caught without having my file saved. I use save place, which will save the place that I last edited a file. So if I were to edit a file, a really big file like this, if I close the file and reopen it, I'll come back to this exact same spot. And finally, I use a package called YASSnippet. I'm not going to talk about this basically at all because I made a whole video on YASSnippet if you're interested. But YASSnippet allows you to create, well, snippets. So for example, at the top of my org files, I'll put in a less than sign T, press tab, and I get this whole title block auto-generated for me. And that's done by YASSnippet. Now let's move on to the visuals section. Visuals section, and this is one of my favorite parts because personally I think that the way my Emacs looks is important. Many people say, well, function before form, and while that's true, being comfortable in whatever you're working on, having the right clothes to do something, having the right tools, feeling comfortable in Emacs is very important. So with that said, here's how I configure my fonts. I use the set face attribute to configure default, fixed pitch, and variable pitch. And what I also do is I have a laptop and a desktop, and the desktop, of course, has a larger screen. So on the desktop, I have this variable set where I can reference off of that to have larger font size on my desktop. And I use something called mixed pitch mode, which is basically a better version of variable pitch mode. If you want to look that up, if you use mixed pitch at all like this, you can see that it keeps what should be fixed pitch, it keeps it fixed, and what should be variable, it makes variable. There's also presentation mode, and this is something I'm using right now, which makes my font size bigger temporarily to make a little presentation or a video. Now here I'm using Doom Modeline, and I have it pretty customized. I have it small because I see no reason to have a large Modeline. It just takes up space and it takes up valuable room. So I have icon on for the major mode and for the Git, but not for anything else. and I keep everything else pretty small, pretty simple. I only show the file name. I don't show the path, and that's being set right here. And there are a lot of options if you're interested in doing that. And I also enable these different modes here. I usually have display time mode on, but I realized I don't know really why I need to know what time it is in my mode line there. I also disable some Windows features. Now what's interesting, in my literate config, this block actually gets read out to early init.el, not init.el like everything else. So here's my early init. You can see all the way down here, these default frame A list options are read down there, are sent down there. And I also make the Aqua title bar. This is just a Mac thing if you're interested in that. And here are a few window options to set the initial frame size. And obviously this is different depending on if I'm on a laptop or a desktop. This just puts the window in the center and makes it the right size, which I like a lot. Now here where I configure my themes, I have a few customizations here like the Modeline, the warning colors in some packages because I don't love the way every theme looks, which is to be expected. And I also load theme based on the time. Now I don't always use Doom 1 or Doom 1 Lite, but just having these is nice because if I'm opening Emacs for the first time late at night, I don't need to be blasted by a light theme. And it's just a little bit of a nice thing to have if I'm opening Emacs for the first time when it's bright or dark out. And my most used themes are the Doom themes, one of the Kowloon themes, and the Modus themes, which is what I'm using right now. And I also use all the icons, which is how I'm getting the icons throughout Emacs. Here's how I configure my line numbers. And something I also use are fringes. I have a margin around all of the whole, around everything. I don't think this is where fringes are set. There's a margin set somewhere. I'm going to have to look for that. But basically, if you'll notice on the bottom, I have a margin between the mode line and the actual edge of the window, and I like a little bit of a margin. I use the Emacs dashboard, which is this little, well, that's not right. I think it's dashboard return. Dashboard refresh buffer. There it is. And this creates a little welcome to Emacs sort of buffer here, just so you have a welcome screen to open up into. I also use something called write room mode. I'm not going to activate this now because I'm in presentation mode. But what this does is it allows me to set pretty thick margins. So as if you were writing a document in an editor like Word or Google Docs or any document editor like that. So I have some pretty big margins on the side, and it also disables the mode line to do stuff like that. And actually, for some reason, my mode line is disabled right now. And a few different things. I use centered cursor mode, you might have noticed. I really like to have my cursor be in the middle of the screen. It just works well for me, so I enable that. And also, when I move forward and backwards sentences in org mode, I actually have it pulse the area. And if you want to look, I have that little bit right here. That about does it for visuals. Next is the big section, or my most favorite, which is org mode. Now, here are all of the org mode packages I use. I don't think I do anything super amazing in any of these, but I'll just take a quick look through some of them. Org Superstar, I have my bullets configured, so a to-do bullet like this. I'm just going to make this a to-do. Oh, it's read-only mode. If I make this a to-do, you'll see that the star turns into a box, which is a pretty nice feature. I also use Evil Org, which gives you some better evil key bindings within org mode. Org gcal, which allows you to sync a Google Calendar to an org mode file. Org appear, which is pretty nice. Now, when you're using emphasis in org mode, like, for example, slashes to make italics, when you move your cursor away from them, the emphasis markers will disappear, and when you highlight them, they will reappear. So it's a clean look, but it's also very functional. Org reveal is something that you can use to create Reveal.js presentations. I actually made a video on that as well. Org.ql is a great search sort of org query language. I'm hoping to make a video on that in a while. Org preview HTML is actually a package that I wrote, which allows you to preview an org file as HTML live. So if you're making a website using org mode, this is a great way to do that. And I also have a bunch of org bindings here. For the rest of them, obviously, they're in where we looked above, but just a few little ones that I define here. I should probably move these anyway. And I have these custom startup functions as well. So on startup, I set a few fonts. I use prettify symbols to make my checkboxes and to make my tags look a certain way, just for a little cleanliness. And I also turn on org indent mode, visual line mode, centered cursor mode, and I set the line spacing to be a bit bigger than it normally is. Now here's the main org config. Here I use package to configure it. And if you'll notice this pin GNU, in case you're curious, this is to make sure I have the latest org mode version, because they just switched from having their own repository to using GNU, I believe. So that does that. Now visuals, people ask me this one all the time. My org ellipsis, normally you'll see when in org mode, when a header is folded, it'll have ellipses, but here I use this little triangle character to make it look like a triangle, like a down arrow. And you can see these other options here. I'm not going to walk through every single one, but a few useful ones. I mean, I like every one of these, but a particularly nice one is this org list emote modify bullet, which is a mouthful. But basically, when I'm making a list in org mode like this, when I promote or demote, whatever it is, a bullet here, it'll automatically change styles, which is pretty nice because I like to have that little separation. Normally, when I'm writing, I'll go with an arrow and then a dot and then a dash, which is a nice little function there. Now I set my tags like this. I set my tags, and then I also set I set my tag faces as well. So I set the name of the tag, and then I set the color of the tag. And then my org tag column is 1 because I like to have the tag not at the end but right next to the heading. To-dos I set the same way. I'm not going to go through these individually because you can all obviously look at these, but I set the to-do, I set the foreground, I set the weight and whatnot. I end up changing these a lot to get the look I want, but that's how it works. And here I set priorities. I actually have priorities A through F, and then I set the faces. Whoops. I set the faces for those priorities as well. Let's get back to where we were. Org-Babel isn't something I use as much as I should, but here I just load the languages and set a few options. Same thing with habits. These are some pretty basic options that you can find everywhere. Now my org agenda, this is a pretty big one. I'm not going to go in depth here again either, but I set my prefix format, which configures the way I look at my agenda. And I'm not going to open that because obviously there's some personal stuff there. But this configures the way it looks, the way it actually functions. So for example, org deadline warning days is 2. So if something's unscheduled and it's due within 2 days, then it'll remind me. Other than that, it won't. There's also org capture. And this is something I'm pretty happy with, actually. My org capture templates, my biggest use for creating org capture templates is for capturing work. So when I want to make a capture, I'll do Control-C, and I'll press W for work to do entries. And there are 4 types of to-do entries. And this is the simplest way, or the least crazy way I found to do this. When I want to capture a to-do, it either has no time, it's scheduled for a certain time, but there's no deadline. There is a deadline, but it's not scheduled, or there's a time to do it, and there's a time it has to be done by. And that's a mouthful, but if you just want to read there, it'll make sense to you. So let's say I get a piece of work, and I know when it has to be done by, and I know when I want to do it. I'll press W, and then I'll put in the type. So let's say it's a project. I'll put in this project, so the name of the project. Then it's going to prompt me for when I should do it. So I want to do it tomorrow, the 26th, and when it should be done by. It should be done by Monday, the 27th. And now here it is, and I can refile it. I'm not going to show you where I'll refile it because, again, that's personal, but I can refile it to the proper org file and the proper heading. Now, this is something that I was inspired by, I believe, some other people. So feel free to take a look at this if you're interested. I also have a lot of exporting options here. I set my backends. I turn on smart quotes, that sort of thing. I turn off that validation button on org mode. If you ever export from org mode HTML, you'll notice there's a button that says validate. I see no reason to have that, so I get rid of that. And a little bit of miscellaneous, which is obviously just ending the use package parenthesis from the beginning org mode setup. Now I'll just take a quick browse through my miscellaneous packages, and we'll call it for this video. I use deft, which allows you to search through all of your files in a certain directory. So for example, in my Dropbox notes directory, I can sort through my files. A little bit of IRC. Oh, probably should not be showing that. I'm not sure. LaTeX stuff. Now this is a still work in progress, but here's how I can configure Octex. Now I'm trying to make it work so that it'll automatically refresh PDF tools. It's not working right now. You can see I have some experiments to make that work. So don't worry about that, but that's how I configure. Working on mail, so I won't show that. I use a package called MW Thesaurus. So let's say I have a word here like brilliant. I can do super one on it, and it'll automatically pop up this Merriam-Webster thesaurus entry for the word, which is pretty neat. I use PDF tools to look at PDFs. It's very nice. Popper.el. This is an interesting package. Popper will create or will turn certain buffers into popper buffers. And what a popper buffer is a buffer that will pop up. So I'll press Control backtick and it'll pop up that buffer, and usually it's messages. So for example, if you need to quickly reference something, you'll just use popper to pop that buffer up, and then you can pop it back away using the same keybind. I also have a few programming related options here. I set up projectile. For package management, I set up rainbow mode and to-do mode. Rainbow mode will highlight any colors. Will highlight different colors. And HL to do will encode when I'm in a code. It'll highlight in a comment. It'll highlight the different things here, like to do, fix me, bug. So they're easier to see. Python. I use Python mode. I'm looking into using LPy, but I also use PyVenv and auto virtual env to automatically set those, and to use virtual environments when I'm working on different projects. And then I also use web mode. I don't use it extensively, so I haven't configured it a lot, but I use it to edit HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It works really nicely. I like the folding options and the automatic indentation, so I have those bound under comma maps here, if you'll remember those. Now, I set those mappings using General, but I also set them in the use package block right here. So if I use package web mode, you'll have your standard init, your standard config, and you can also use this :general, and then you can add in a line of some General.el key binding configuration like that. Now that about does it for this video. I wanted to say thanks for sticking through. I have to say I doubt anyone has watched all the way through, but I hope if you're here that at least you found some use out of some of the sections of my configuration. Again, you can find the GitHub link to my configuration in the description, where you can download this file, which I wouldn't recommend because it probably won't work for you, but you can look at the file, copy some of the functions, copy some of the use package blocks, look at how I'm doing things, see if it'll inform you at all. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop a comment. I try and reply to all of them.